All right, 6 o'clock Eastern. Thank you for joining a two-way conversation with Ambassador Richard Grenell. Conversation like no other is our tagline here. And this is intended to be a conversation like no other, at least that I've seen Rick do, which is to say, we're going to talk about national security, foreign policy, international relations. We're not here to talk about politics or the campaign, although we'll touch a little bit on President Trump. But really, this is for the opportunity for you all to be able to ask Rick questions about his vision of the world, how he sees things, both a little bit backward looking, but also going forward. I'll ask Rick a couple questions, and then my hope is to have this session be driven by you all. So if you've got a question about national security, international relations, be ready to raise your hand, unmute yourself, camera on, and ask Rick a question. We'll get to as many of you as we can. And again, it's a great opportunity, and Rick, we're grateful to you for taking it. I want to just start by asking, I've known you for a long time, and you're now someone who talks to heads of state around the world, someone who has the ear of one of the two people who are likely to be the next president. I'm wondering just if you can share with people from when you were a kid till now, what's kind of the arc of your interest in international relations, national security, and foreign policy?
Good question. I think my gut reaction to that is when I left graduate school at the Kennedy School, I went to San Diego. I was the top political and communications person for the mayor of San Diego. And San Diego is such a big city mayor. It's a big city, and working for the mayor meant that you had a lot of binational issues. And I was always interested in foreign policy, but I really got a good chunk of it there because this was obviously before 9/11, and we had talked about having a airport, the first binational airport in San Diego, where it would be, between Tijuana and San Diego County. And we were working through a lot of those issues. Fast forward, my boss at the time, Susan Golding, became a champion of the 2000 John McCain campaign. And then I found myself working on the 2000 John McCain campaign, had a blast on that. And then I got lucky in that when George Bush became president in 2000, he appointed my friend Ari Fleischer to the White House spokesman's job. And Ari and I just began to talk about a series of jobs. I ended up at the UN, long story. And, Mark, if you know me, I'm a religious person. I grew up evangelical Christian. And I look back at that time. I spent 8 years at the UN, and I never really understood why I spent 8 years there. It was a long time. I tried for other jobs. It just in the administration down in Washington. I was based in New York. Never really clicked, and it never really happened. And now I look back, and that was my training ground, to be at the UN and to have a inside view of the Security Council every single day. I'm the longest serving political appointee for America inside the Security Council. I saw all the IAEA reports in detail for Iran. I was there for Syria. I was there for the Iraq War, Afghanistan war. I really learned a lot. I dealt with the ambassador at the time from Russia was Sergei Lavrov, who's now the foreign minister. Dealt with him every day and know him well. I saw how the Chinese maneuver. I saw how they try to link with Russia as much as possible, but there's a really great set of tools to de-link them. They should not be natural allies. And I think that's one of the rules that I've kind of learned about foreign policy. Make sure you're always watching to ensure that Russia and China are not ganging up on you. I learned a lot about the French and the British at that point, what their priorities are in terms of being a veto member. It was a blast. It was daunting at some levels, but I got up close to 4 different U.S. ambassadors to the UN to understand their style, what worked, what didn't work. It was a great training ground. So I think that's kind of the trajectory of really what set me into foreign policy.
For those who don't know, tick off the 4 ambassadors you worked with.
John Negroponte, then John Danforth, then John Bolton, and then Zelmay Khalilzad.
Yeah. So I grew up in a household because my dad worked at the Pentagon and the National Security Council, where foreign affairs was sitting around our living room, and a lot of people I knew were diplomats, both American diplomats and not. You've come to this now. You're quite experienced, having again sort of stumbled into a little bit by your account. Do you consider yourself kind of a member of the foreign policy community? Are you a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, or do you think of yourself as an outsider?
I'm not a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I am definitely an outsider to Washington, D.C. I think the place is broken. I think the NGO system, when I was at the UN for the US, I managed all of the US relationships with NGOs. And it's a jobs program in many ways. They like to have big contracts and money, and they like to, have events, and it's a system that works for them. And nothing was more stark about the brokenness of the NGOs and the system in Washington for me than when I became presidential envoy for Kosovo and Serbia. There was a collective screaming from the NGOs that cover the Balkans at the time, because they said, oh, he doesn't know anything about the Balkans. To which my response was, a lot of you who know a lot about the Balkans for 20 years have never really come up with the right idea, and certainly haven't moved us forward. And so I see that system. It's a locked system. And in many ways, I feel that this is what they do to Donald Trump, is that if you're not there in Washington, if you're not around, if you're not a member of the council, if you're not going all the time, then they just lock you out. It's like the Mean Girls. And so I've learned that it's kind of a waste of time to sit around with people who just want to talk about the issues and not really get anything done. So that's a long answer to say,
Yeah.
I don't live in Washington. I'm happily on the outside. And I think listening to regular people and learning what's a priority for Americans and what works for America and our national security is a better way.
So just to gild the lily a little bit, I think is it fair to say that you don't view conducting American foreign policy as something only experts, quote unquote, experts can do? That someone from the outsider perspective may be more effective rather than someone who's been a long time part of the American foreign policy establishment. Is that
Yeah, I would say it's slightly different in that certainly there are NGOs that have experts that I talk to. I talk to a lot of people individually that I call regularly about different issues. But that's different than the NGO doing an event and, they're longtime strategists. What I really enjoy are the people who are rolling up their sleeves and trying to get to know the issues. One of the things about Twitter, for instance, is you can follow people who are literally inside Ukraine watching every single day what's happening and getting, great information, or in Gaza or in the Balkans. And so you don't really need the NGO white paper anymore. You don't need the New York Times reporter that's like 12 hours old with a editor kind of changing it. You can actually get information right from the front lines. And while you've got to always question the information and get opposing information to understand what the real story is, I don't find it that different than the reporters who cover the issue. I'm getting better information from people who are on Twitter with, maybe 1,000 or 1,500 followers, but I can follow a whole bunch of people from different countries in the Balkans, or I can do that within Ukraine, and that's what I do. And so I talk to a lot of those people and get great information.
I'm going to ask you about a few hotspots around the world, and then turn it over to the folks at the two-way community for their questions. So folks, be thinking of your questions, be ready to raise your hand to ask them. First I want to ask you about is something you mentioned, which is China and Russia. Their alliance, whether it's active or more passive, is obviously a huge challenge for the United States and has been for some time. And I'm wondering whether beyond the tactical things that a U.S. government can do, needs to do you see any big strategic kind of North Stars of how the United States should deal with the alliance between those two countries that are our enemies and rivals in so many ways?
Yeah, one thing that I learned at the UN is that, you have a country like China that organizes with the G77, the developing world, while at the same time gets a veto at the Security Council. So they're really trying to play both sides as a superpower and a developing nation. And so there's hundreds of UNICEF workers paid for by the UN that are trying to help the Chinese feed its own people. It's a big problem when you look at all of the UN programs that are involved in helping China. So I think that there's a way that you can begin to play the information game. We've never done that very well in the United States. Look, I'm a 12-year diplomat of the State Department. I believe that the State Department should have a very strong voice in front of the president to avoid war. And there's a whole bunch of tools that the State Department gets to use. And so what I would say is we're not utilizing all those tools enough to avoid conflict and to avoid the problems that could rise up. So, for instance, the people inside China, the citizens, they don't always know what's happening. And the Chinese government loves that. They like to be able to control the message. They want information flow to go through them. Now, we could play that game of making sure that information goes to the people. That's not a war. That might be an information war, but it's certainly not a military war. I think the State Department should be doing more things like that. They should be evaluating constantly. How are we getting the information to the people inside Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, China? And I think we got to be much more aggressive about that. Certainly we have the technology, we know that, and we've just never really utilized it. That's one thing. The second thing I would say about China is that we've got to just get tougher from the standpoint of not welcoming them into the international framework if they're not pulling their own weight. For instance, they're in the WTO. That's a disaster. We allowed them to go into the WTO, Bill Clinton did, because there was this theory that engagement with the Chinese might work. And so we try engagement. And by the way, I'm at the time, I think I was wildly for it because I do like engagement. I don't think that it's a bad thing to try to engage with hostile countries and see what works. But you have to have a quick benchmark a year, 18 months later to say, did our engagement work? And I think when it comes to China and the WTO, we should have learned that lesson a lot faster than what we did in that democracy, human rights, the rule of law, all of those things that we wanted China to get better on didn't happen. They actually got worse on some of these issues. And so we should admit that our engagement with China, bringing them into the WTO, did not work. And I'm for engaging with them, but we've got to recognize that bringing them into the WTO and with that huge reward, we're going to have to make some changes and be a little tougher on them with that.
Should the goal be to try to drive a wedge between China and Russia? And if so, what ways could the U.S. do that?
I wouldn't necessarily say a wedge, but I think that there needs to be a recognition that they have different goals. Russia and China are not natural allies. They have different negotiating styles. They don't necessarily trust each other like many people think that they do. And there are ways for us to make sure that our relationship with China is different than with Russia in a way that it's not America and Russia and China on the other side. We can't have the West versus Russia and China. We've seen too many times that that's a bad thing. But I do think that it's easier than what people think. I know both of their negotiating styles well. I know what they like when they come to the multilateral table. I've seen them inside the Security Council for 8 years. And they are not natural allies. They don't prioritize the same things.
Is there something you think you know or do know about Xi that you think is misunderstood in the United States?
I mean, I have to be a little careful here from being the acting DNI. I would say that there are things that we can do to communicate with all the leaders in China and not just go through Xi.
Okay. NATO is obviously a topic you spent a lot of time on when you were ambassador to Germany. And there's been a big debate for a long time about what the role of NATO should be. What do you think the role of NATO should be in 5, 10 years?
5, 10 years. Well, first of all, I think let's start from the fact that NATO has been, greatly successful in the past. We have many situations that we can point to. It's a great alliance. But by any practical measure, if you look at who's paying and what the capabilities are, there should be a great concern for the American taxpayer and the American government. Remember that the NATO's capabilities is I like to call it a wedding registry. When you come to the wedding, you go and you sign up and you look at the NATO registry, and countries are supposed to sign up for the capabilities that they can deliver in case we need them. And those capabilities all work together. And you're supposed to sign up until you reach at least 2% of your GDP. And so the NATO capabilities are listed and known. And, a country like Germany, where I have a lot of friends, and I'm very tough on the German government, mainly because my German friends tell me, keep giving it to them. They have never successfully signed up for these capabilities. As an example, they signed up to bring some trainers to Afghanistan and found that they couldn't even get their trainers to Afghanistan because they didn't have a transport plane. And so these are just some basic things that I think we've got to force the Germans to do. When you count the rotational troops from America, there are 50,000 troops, U.S. troops, including the rotational troops, in Germany.
I'm asking, pardon me, I'm asking you different than the issue you're talking about, which is the equity concerns about contributions from the other partners. But I'm saying, leave that aside. What's the mission? Should the mission go back to worrying about Russian tanks going into Paris? Should the mission be oriented away from Russia and towards Asia or other parts of the world?
Well, look, I think the original mission, what we should be concentrating on, is the threat from Russia. That is why we had rotational troops in Germany, why we had troops there, because the whole theory was if Russia started to invade on the ground, we've got to get our troops over to slow them down long enough to get our air transports in, our military from the sky. And what is important to note is that we don't even have the ability with the Germans right now to get those troops on the ground in. So we're failing at the old idea of NATO. What I think the new idea of NATO is just to look at all of the threats and then adjust the capabilities that way. For instance, right now, I think one of the clear threats that we have is a cyber threat. How can a hostile actor shut down our electrical grid, our energy grid? There's a whole bunch of things that we should be very nervous about. And NATO, as an alliance of the West, should be able to tackle those issues. So you ask yourself on the capabilities for that priority, who has the best cyber capabilities? Where are we spending money? That's a place where the Germans could do really well. It doesn't have to be traditionally building submarines. But I think what you do is you start with what are the threats, come up with the threats that the West wants to conquer and control. And at that point, then you go through the capabilities and say, what can you provide? I don't think we're doing that right now. I think we're stuck into the entirety of the military part of NATO. And remember, at least for the United States, NATO falls under the State Department. It's a diplomatic post. While it coordinates with the Pentagon, the U.S. ambassador to NATO is a diplomat, and that means that you're supposed to be avoiding war. You're supposed to be doing the things that make sure that we don't have to go to war.
Last question for me, and then I see a couple hands up, so we're going to start going to folks, and others, please feel free to raise your hand. There's been a lot of speculation, informed and uninformed debate about whether China may try to invade Taiwan. Where do you see that right now? What are the prospects of it? What are you looking at to get a handle on whether that's something Xi might attempt?
Well, Mark, I'm super clear about what my role is as a diplomat and as someone who worked at the State Department. So I think right now, if that is a threat, then the State Department and all the diplomats have to be focused on avoiding a military action. That is our goal. So what can we do to make sure that we avoid military action between China and Taiwan? I think there's a whole bunch of things. And certainly some of the things that I listed before, which is going on the diplomatic push with China to understand where their vulnerabilities are and make sure that we are pushing on information, on data, on cyber, doing all of those things that that they care about. They care about their economy more than anything. I think they saw what happened in Russia when the entire world began to sanction Russia. That was a very strong message to the Chinese to say, don't forget, if you make a move militarily, there is this diplomatic tool of international sanctions that can be immediately put in play, and your economy can be crushed. Now, I think we see with Russia getting around the sanctions quite a bit. They're making more money on energy now. I think the Chinese also see that as a possibility to say, well, we can get around your sanctions. Your sanctions don't seem to be working. So that's another reason to really get the sanctions entities, the diplomatic squeeze right, because otherwise, if those are weak, if all of our diplomatic responses are too weak and we fail, then China and or the US are going to easily say, well, now it's time to go to war. I think that when there's a war, we need to admit that our diplomats failed. And so right now we need to be having, you know, a push diplomatically, a diplomatic surge, if you will. And I don't see it happening.
Doug Workman, I'll ask you to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, Mr. Grenell. My question to you has to deal with understanding of history. How important is it to diplomacy? And what happens when the person at the highest level of government doesn't have that understanding of history and is not interested in understanding history?
I mean, obviously, it's incredibly important to understand history so that you don't repeat the mistakes. But I also think that there's something different than just an academic response. We see a lot of academics in government who have not worked out well. They haven't been able to adjust to the current realities on the ground. And I think I was getting to that a little bit with the NGO community, which I think is highly academic and doesn't have enough of this scrappy on the ground information of just how reality works. One of the things that I would say about your question in terms of history, we had to apply that when we were doing our negotiations between Serbia and Kosovo. We're trying to negotiate economic agreements. We, to be honest, I think we were successful because we were vocally and passionately ignoring the 20+ year history that had been the conflict. We were acknowledging that we're, as Americans, as the West, we weren't here when there was a war, and the emotions were incredible. And I tried to tell both sides, I will never understand the killings that happened here because my family wasn't here. My family wasn't affected. But I also challenged them to say, well, I don't feel and understand the history. You have to understand that there's a value in me coming in without history. There is a value for me coming in and saying, look, the reality is we have to look forward and we have to try everything that we can to begin to have these economies and these people work. Otherwise, your young people are leaving. They're not going to be around for the next generation. There's no jobs. There's no security. When security is actually being enforced by NATO troops, the private sector is not coming in. So it's really going to cripple and kill your economy and your people. And so there was a value in coming in and while deferring to the history and being sensitive to it, not being trapped by it and bringing in a lot of those old debates.
Rick, I may be putting you on the spot with this, but is there a work of history that informs kind of your sense of national security, international relations Guns of August or any book like that?
I tend to pick and choose different types of people and chapters in books because I don't always agree with everything that someone would say, and so I have a team of people that will say you need to read this chapter in a book. I don't want to throw out anybody in particular, but I've tweeted about some of those over the last 6 months. People that I talk to regularly that have written books that have good chapters and good nuggets. I think obviously there are people that we can learn from, but everybody is going to kind of bring their worldview into this. My worldview is going to be very different than an academic or very different from somebody who, like Condi Rice, who spent, her life really understanding Russia from an academic standpoint. She's got insight into how Russia works that nobody will ever have. And I think that informed her diplomacy. And what we have to be able to do is judge people on their outcomes, judge people on not their style, but what did they accomplish? And I was incredibly proud of the work that we did between Kosovo and Serbia because we got 4 economic agreements when we were told we wouldn't get any, and that the history would show that these people have been fighting for X hundreds of years and that there was no hope. I think presenting a plan, a diplomatic plan that was sensitive to the history but looking forward and really pushing people to say, do this for your next generation, your kids who don't want to stay here if there are no jobs. We need to absolutely fix some of these problems. You don't have to like someone to do business with them, but you need to recognize that if you don't do business with them, if you're just seeking to cancel them, that it's not going to be good for your community, your family, or your country's history. You've got to move on. Now, look, that sounds incredibly insensitive. And I get that. And we spent a lot of time saying, we understand that you're going to be angry when we have to ignore the war and the killing and a lot of those issues. But there's a value in that. And I think people began to see that after our many meetings and listening tours. But it's not without criticism, for sure. And I think that's fair criticism.
Thank you. John Cox.
Hey, Rick. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
You're enjoying California. Question for you. Economics is a big interest of mine, and I'm looking at what's going on in the world with Iran and Russia causing significant problems that are costing U.S. taxpayers a whole lot of money. The support we're giving Israel is related, frankly, to Iran spending its resources, which they're getting from oil. Same with Russia. That's a country, that's a gas station posing as a country, as we know. What's your thought about developing oil resources in America and, driving the price of oil way down so these countries feel the heat and give up or at least ameliorate a lot of their designs on helping foment these problems around the world that we have to end up trying to spend our resources to clean up?
Yeah, it's a good question, John.
Great
Thank you. Look, I believe that energy and water are 2 of the issues that we've got to get right because they cause conflicts and ultimately wars. And they're very expensive to fix. And so when you look at Iran, for instance, I think everyone should look at the facts to agree that when we sanctioned Iran and we told the international community, you can't do business with Iran, that was a good thing. Now, we got highly criticized from our European friends and from the media for that. But I think it was the right thing. As soon as they changed the policy on funding Iran and gave them billions of dollars in sanctions relief, credit, and cash, no one should be surprised that we're going to see Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, all funded through Iran. The Iranian regime doesn't want to fight themselves. And that's why they are really aggressive about paying for others, because they don't want that to happen. You'll notice that there's not a lot of terrorism inside Iran. They don't put up with it, and they export it, and they export it for their own control. Now also in terms of Russia, I don't understand why we're allowing certain countries to have waivers and to still buy Russian energy. It's not right, and it certainly is making us less stable. Russia has more sales now than they ever have, and yet we have an administration that keeps saying, we're squeezing them and we're doing everything we can to punish them. But this is an administration too that I have to call out for changing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline sanctions. We in the Trump administration sanctioned that Putin pipeline. It never became operational. We watched it very closely. It was one of my top issues in Germany. We got a lot of pushback. I've been, sending out articles over the last couple of weeks from 6 years ago, where reporters were saying that we were mean-spirited and that our sanctions policy was ignoring the fact that the Putin pipeline was going to be a reality. Chancellor Merkel was lobbying Joe Biden. And when the Biden administration came in, Senate Democrats and Joe Biden dropped sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, Putin's pipeline, giving him the ability to start collecting money. Now, we know what happened to the pipeline later, but the reality is that was a mistake to allow sanctions relief on Putin's pipeline. And I believe, and I can make the argument, that was the first sign to Putin that this American administration, combined with some European allies, would be naive. And he decided at that point to begin planning to go inside Ukraine and finish the job that he had done before Donald Trump came into office. I think that's just the reality. The floor speeches that Senate Democrats gave when they voted to drop the Putin sanctions are really telling. They are some speeches that say sanctioning Russia in this way on this pipeline is the wrong thing to do. The German foreign minister at the time said it was going to invite a war. And I think that we need to face reality that the opposite was true.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, John. Roger Baskin. You need to unmute, please.
Okay. My question is about the Middle East. Once Yahya Sinwar is taken out, will that be the beginning of the end of the Gaza war, resulting in the release of the hostages? And once the war is over, how does one rebuild Gaza so it looks more like the UAE than a Hamas enclave?
Well, first of all, it's a great question, and it's a very detailed question, and there's no magic elixir, certainly. What I think has to happen is we need to collectively defeat Hamas. We need to collectively get the hostages back, and that needs to be the focus. We cannot be rewarding the current leadership of the Palestinians with any talk of rebuilding right now. That would be, I think, a disaster. The next step for me is to recognize that the United States has an incredible role to play. It doesn't mean that we have to put our money or our people there, but we are the country that needs to bring people together. I realized at the UN that no program works well unless there's US attention and US leadership to these programs. The fact of US participation must be calculated into any successful program. And so what I would say is that the US role is to bring our Arab allies and others to the table. I think that means Saudi Arabia, Turkey. I think you've got to include Qatar, the UAE. You've got to bring all of the players together to say, one, we will not do anything with Hamas in any leadership role anywhere. Deal with that. And then two, I think we need to recognize that, Abbas was elected in 2005 to a 5-year term. He's now in his 19th year of his 5-year term. I'm not suggesting that the place is ready for free and fair elections, but I do think that they should get their act together to have elections, and we should do the best that we can and see what the outcome is. And at the same time, our Arab leaders need to go in and help organize and figure out who the best leader is and get behind that leader so that there is, in the beginning, a collective approach. But I think that the U.S. can do that. I think that there's deals to be made to get the Turks to have a larger role. We do know that they've got some issues in Syria. All these conversations need to be had so that we can force some sort of a stability. And then once there's stability and leadership and a level of trust, then we can go out and talk about rebuilding and making sure that we don't have a system where the people don't have enough economic development around so that they can't get a job, they can't have hope to get a job. I think that's really important. But that's, later. I've been very clear that the first step right now is to get the hostages home and to crush Hamas. I think we should have done that a lot faster. We shouldn't have put so many stop signs on Israel. We should have let them get in and do the job and not have this 270-day, whatever it is today, situation where we still have American hostages being held inside Gaza.
Rick, if you could choose, what country or countries or entity would be involved with helping rebuild Gaza the day after the day after?
Look, I think everybody's got to help after you get the hostages returned, a guarantee of Hamas gone, a guarantee that there's new Palestinian leadership that's interested in the people. Those are building blocks that you have to have in order.
But should America be the leader of that effort?
Look, I think that the Americans have to be the leader, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to give the money. What I believe is that we have great know-how, we have got great private sector development, but nothing is going to happen from a Western country or a Western entity unless you get the region involved. You've got to have Turkey, you've got to have the Saudis, you've got to have the UAE. I think you have to include Qatar, but they all have an interest in making sure that this moves forward. I mean, you look and see what's happening in Jordan right now. I'm very concerned that Jordan falls. If you look at what's happening, if you follow people inside Jordan, it is a tinderbox. And I think that the king and Queen Rania have spoken out in desperation. I don't like what they're saying, but I think that if you're dealing with this chaos inside and you're watching no hope linger, I think you start to say desperate things. And I see that very clearly what's happening in Jordan. I'm very concerned about it. And let's be honest, if Jordan has a problem and somehow collapses, Egypt is going to be quickly behind it. And this could be a tinderbox. This is what we're dealing with. We did not have this under Donald Trump. We had Arab-Israeli peace agreements. And now we have multiple wars and talk of countries collapsing.
Thank you, Rick. Thank you for the question, Roger. Kristen.
Yeah, hi. Just a quick question. I know we weren't going to talk specifically about the elections, but just do you foresee that if Trump is elected, that much of his foreign policy direction from his first term would sort of continue on to the second, and potential, Arab Accord furthering with Saudi recognition, or but also on just a broader scale, if it will be similar to his first term?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I do. I mean, this is one of the things that I say constantly to my European friends who love to write articles about what's Donald Trump going to be like in a second term. And I say, you know exactly what he's going to be like because you watched him in the first term. I think there's unfinished business that President Trump would seek to do. But he's an outsider. He's not a politician. And that's where I think NATO benefited from more money. There wasn't a talk of getting out of NATO. There was a talk of that from the media. But President Trump was negotiating to give the entity more money. And I can argue that if you're out there wanting to give an entity more money, I think that you believe in the entity. You at least believe in it enough to give it some more money and to make it better. I think that, the criticism that we've seen from U.S. ambassadors to NATO from the Clinton administration, one in particular, is a cheap shot because they talked about getting other countries to pay their 2% during the Clinton and even Bush administrations. They failed. They didn't do it. And so now they're kind of climbing up and saying, oh, you're undermining NATO. No, I think undermining NATO is allowing countries to not pay their 2%, as other US ambassadors to NATO did. I think that somebody needs to push back on them and say, wait a minute, you're giving advice, but you failed at this task. You were not able to make NATO stronger by having countries rise up and be able to pay for their capabilities. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that people constantly say right now about Donald Trump's second term is what's going to happen with NATO. I think you will see him do exactly what he did before, which, by the way, the Albanian prime minister, Edi Rama, who is a socialist and a friend of George Soros, there's some great clips of him saying publicly in front of Anthony Blinken that Donald Trump actually made NATO stronger and gave NATO more money. And this is, a very real, factual comment. And I've seen other leaders do the same thing. So I think the answer is already known. We know exactly what Donald Trump is going to do. He's going to produce more peace agreements and try to avoid every single possible war.
Rick, he talks about having learned from his first term and how he'd be better just in general in a second term. Is there any area that you think would be more different, adjusted, or just exactly a carbon copy of when he first came in?
Well, I wouldn't say carbon copy because he's definitely learned. Certainly on personnel is one thing. I always say this, and this is just my opinion, is knowing President Trump and knowing him as an outsider, that when he came into office, like an outsider would, he believed that you got to get the C-suite right? If you're the CEO, you get your office right and you get your leaders in that office, and then the entity kind of follows. And I think what he learned is getting the White House right, getting all of your loyalists at the White House isn't enough. You've got to actually get them into the department, the assistant secretary of this and that and whatever department. And so you've got to go a little deeper into that. It's one of the reasons why I, working for the State Department and for, I worked in Congress for a while. It's one of the reasons why I didn't necessarily want to go to the White House in 2016. I wanted to go out and begin to be a part of that, administration that was sending people out to try to reform the government.
Kristen, thank you for the question. And Kristen opened the door to discussing President Trump. And as I understand it, in the context of his recently getting, at least approaching the debate, they don't like to say he's doing debate prep, but I understand you've spoken to him a couple of times. I wonder what you can tell us about those conversations.
Yeah, I won't go into detail because I try to keep all my conversations with President Trump very private. As you know, I'm not somebody who talks to the reporters like most of Washington, but I spoke to President Trump a couple of times this past weekend. And, his debate prep is unique in that he was the president. He follows these issues every single day. And so talking about the issues is really reminding him of, I think, what the priorities are. And that's debate prep, spending time with him talking about these issues. And there's a lot of people that do that. I'm happy to talk to him about any issue that he wants to talk about. It's mainly foreign policy and national security.
Okay, thank you for that. Question from Ava. Unmute, please.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Rick, for being here. I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how you think about negotiating rather an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. One could definitely envision a scenario where negotiations drag out if trying to negotiate an end. Would you advocate, for instance, for sending additional aid to Ukraine to strengthen Ukraine's hand, for example? Or how are you thinking about that?
Good question. I hope you realize I'll be a little bit generic, and I'll have a little rule at the top to say this is not something that I'm talking to President Trump about. So these are just my ideas. I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I think President Trump's going to win. But let me just state for the record that in my kind of years of diplomacy and watching how we have agreements, that we need an agreement. We need a tough agreement. I think Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 are agreements that I've studied a lot. I've asked a lot of people who worked on those what they think the problem is. And I think most people agree that there wasn't a mechanism to hold Russia accountable. Some people will say the Russians never really wanted to implement it. But look, I think all that's true. And we got to have a tougher mechanism to hold them to account. And maybe that's a sliding scale of sanctions relief or whatever the carrot is. But here's what I would say is what I've learned about diplomacy, especially in Kosovo and Serbia, is that once you can get parties to see a vision and to say, you know, oh gosh, I don't want to do this, but maybe the pluses outweigh the minuses, and you know exactly where they are uncomfortable on each point, that's when diplomacy starts. It's not once it's signed, then you're done and you just hope that both sides go implement it. You got to hold their feet to the fire. You've got to help implement it. You've got to have a team that reminds them why they've signed it. Remember that all of the parts of that agreement where they were uncomfortable, and help them get through it. I think the tough part starts as soon as you sign the agreement. And that's not what happened on Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. There was a collective sigh of relief. There was a jovial, moment, and people were congratulating each other and just thought, well, let's hope everybody implements it. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. I certainly learned that with our agreements in Kosovo, Serbia. I wish after we made our big agreement that there would have been more people holding both sides to account. The Trump team was now gone. The Biden team came in, and I was pleased that they embraced all 4 agreements as U.S. policy. They said these are great agreements. They should be implemented. But there was never a team to push them. And so it's a long answer on Russia and Ukraine to say, I think there's some elements of Minsk 1 and Minsk 2 that can be used, not all, but some. I'm very clear-eyed about the threat from China, but the Chinese had a peace agreement, I'd say about 2 years ago now, that they put forward, which I'm confident enough to say I've read it, and there were some good parts to it. They actually had some pieces that could be used. Even President Zelensky at the time, spoke out and he said, wow, I've read the Chinese plan, and the Chinese believe in territorial integrity for Ukraine. And he was very pleased. I just felt like that was a moment to really dig in and to have an agreement that is hard fought. But we know very clearly what both sides want. The Ukrainians want territorial integrity. The Russians want to make sure that Ukraine is not a part of NATO. And I believe that there's elements here to put something together. I don't know why the State Department has not put together a team to offer up a peace plan, but it's clear to me that the White House doesn't want a peace plan. They're not interested. Blinken is not coming up with one. Nobody at the State Department is pushing one. And so we just keep lingering and talking about war, and more funding for war. And I find that to be a tragedy for the State Department.
Rick, knowing you're not speaking for the former president and knowing you want to be generic, is a peace deal that involves Russia keeping Crimea, is that something that the U.S. should consider?
Look, I'll say this is just my opinion again, because I've not talked specifically about what a peace deal would look like. And with President Trump, we're talking about, policies from the past and what he did, reminding all of the policies that worked, and certainly concentrating on winning an election. We're not putting the cart before the horse. Anyone who knows President Trump knows he's superstitious. You're not gonna, talk about jobs or policies. You just, nobody does that, honestly. And I know that it's hard for Washington types to understand that, but that's the reality. But I would say that, no, I think territorial integrity for Ukraine, I think that you have to do that. But, Mark, there's some diplomatic maneuvering within that. And certainly Chancellor Merkel and Barack Obama did that. They used autonomous regions. And again, I'll just go back to say I've talked to quite a few people that were involved in Minsk and Minsk 1, Minsk 2, and there is this autonomous region that
What is
allows.
this? Oh, that's for the State
Sorry,
Department.
hold on one
It's
second.
there. This would be good to.
We'll find that. Somebody needs to mute. We'll find them.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah. So I think there's elements there, and we just have to be smart about how we utilize that language of autonomous regions. But I would say that what Merkel and Obama did in terms of theorizing about autonomous regions is a good diplomatic tool. But again, it wasn't, it just collapsed after it was signed. There was no team trying to hold Russia to account or take the temperature on a every other day basis to say, are we still in this? Are we still trying to implement? I'm smart enough to know that no agreement is really going to hold forever. But I think that you can hold it long enough to change the facts on the ground and then make it easier.
Ava, thank you. Doug Carey.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for doing this call. Very interesting to hear from you, and I've changed my question at least 3 times in the last 45 minutes. Well, the one I would like to ask you is your comment about rebuilding Gaza and that requiring European participation. Obviously, Ukraine's going to need to rebuild sometime too. Is Europe going to step up to that? The right wing has taken hold in Germany much more than it has in the past. Marine Le Pen is very likely to be the next president of France. These are all very much isolationist kind of people. And certainly the agenda that President Trump has run on is the America First agenda. He's not talking about spending money on Gaza, although in the end he may do that. So what is the likelihood that these places are going to be rebuilt by anybody in the world after this war finally is over?
Yeah, look, I think it's a good question. I would deny your premise a little bit because Olaf Scholz is a socialist, and his partner is the Green Party, and they have been very slow to do their part. So I'm not sure that you can just blame the AfD or a far right, CSU or CDU, whatever you want to label them. I do think that with the European elections, the pendulum swinging to many of the center right parties was because of the policies of the center left just not worked, and people are frustrated. And it's probably why, although my friend Liz Truss is going to hate that I say this, but it's probably why Labour will win on July 4th in the UK, just because the Tories haven't delivered and there's a frustration. So that pendulum happens to be swinging back the other way. I think the theme is performance, the current government's not being able to deliver and talking about too much politics. And so the reaction is to go the other way. It just so happened that throughout the rest of Europe, there is a control by center left governments that are now going to be held to account by the swing. But I take your point that the Europeans are not great at volunteering to step up. And that's a challenge. I think that we've got to do a much better job. Our U.S. ambassadors to Europe, our Secretary of State, our White House, our business community, of really saying to our European partners that they're going to have to make some changes. You can't be the West and not stand up for Western values. We need to be able to shake, I think, traditional Europe. I'm encouraged. I travel a lot in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans, and I'm very encouraged by that region. Some of the most pro-Western thinking countries are in Central and Eastern Europe, and that we see that within the EU structure that's a big challenge. And reminding our friends in Europe that the European Union got smaller and weaker because they couldn't control their immigration issue when Brexit happened, I think is a really good reminder to say we got to deliver for the people, and people who are paying taxes want to be able to look and say that they are healthier, stronger, more secure, and are having a better life for their kids.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the question. Matthew Bartlett. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Rick, this is great. Thanks so much for doing this. And yeah, remember the administration days, America first, but it was never America alone. And I think you have talked about how sometimes war is the easy part, and peace and diplomacy is a result of very difficult work. That diplomats do. Listen, it's a crazy world. A lot to show what America is against. Can you just talk more, maybe about the importance of what we are for, and maybe some of our strategic engagement, whether it's PEPFAR, the Global HIV/AIDS program, or some of the stuff that Keith Kroc was doing, the clean networks and technology around the world. And thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So I of course love the phrase that America first doesn't mean America alone, because I fundamentally believe in my heart, and I'm passionate about the fact that when America puts itself first, what follows is the rule of law, respect for human rights, capitalism, democracy, all of the great things that we want to do through the UN. I think the reality is that my foreign policy, this may be the perfect answer to Mark's first question of kind of my worldview. My worldview much of the time came from the multilateral institution of the UN, where I spent 8 years. I know what works and I know what doesn't work. And one of the things that works is programs that are that countries concentrate on, that they're charged with, and that they're involved with. And that's a variety of different programs. I mean, there's some very successful programs at UNICEF and World Food Program that if we didn't have, we'd have to invent. And so I like the idea of looking at successful programs and then building around those. I think that when it comes to traditional institutions, that we also, America needs to recognize that the UN isn't the be-all, end-all. We don't have to go through the UN. We need allies, and we can find those allies in a variety of places. Some people call that the coalition of the willing. I believe that there are a whole bunch of countries that are frustrated with Iran enough to where you don't have to go through the UN, you don't have to go through the OSCE, you don't have to go through the World Bank. You can actually form coalitions of countries that believe in that one issue, that want to join you. And I think the Trump administration did that very successfully. We had a lot of support for NATO members that were paying their fair share to pressure the ones that weren't. We had a lot of support from countries that were saying, we need to do something better on Iran and the sanctions entity. And a lot of countries joined in. Now, part of diplomacy is convincing the ones on the fence that they have to join in. We have a lot of people who talk about joining the West, but then they don't deliver. And some of those countries are actually in Europe. And so I don't think that it's bad to push these other countries to join the West. I don't think that our Western friends should take a long time to figure out whose side they're on in Venezuela. And that was one of my criticisms for my friend Chancellor Merkel, is that she took like 2.5 weeks to figure out whose side she was on. And I said at the time, Madam Chancellor, you are the largest economy in Europe. You're a leader in the West. You have to act like it. This has to be a Western knee-jerk reaction to support the West. And so I don't want to be trapped by entities that are adrift. I think we use them when we can to further our goals. And we have great respect for some of them, but some of them need a lot of changing. And I think that forming the coalitions that we need at the time for the specific issue is the way to go.
Matthew, thank you for the question. Jacqueline, Bruce, I'm not going to call on you because we've got a minute left, and I apologize for not getting to you, but I don't want to go over because that's one of our rules, but thank you. And Rick, real quick, I ask this of presidential candidates all the time. I ask them who their model Supreme Court justice is. Who's your model Secretary of State? What contemporary or historical Secretary of State do you think did the job best?
I would say there's a compilation of people. Certainly James Baker, Condi Rice, Colin Powell did some great things. I would probably use those three as the model.
Okay.
I think there's been a lot of great diplomats, career diplomats that I talk to currently that I get a lot of advice from that I think would fit in that mold as well.
Who's the best foreign policy leader in the Biden administration?
I don't think I can answer that, Mark, and that's just an honest question, an honest answer. I think there's too many academics. I will say this though, maybe this makes a little news, and this is honest. There have been several career people that the Biden team have nominated for ambassadorial posts that I've gone to bat for, that I've called people who on our side that had holds on those people. And I said, look, for what it's worth, I just want you to know, I know them, they're career people. They might have been nominated by Joe Biden, but they're really good people and they're really talented and we should support them.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read you an email I got just a moment ago from a Democrat who dropped off the call a few minutes ago, who familiar with you, but had never heard you talk. And he said, I was very impressed listening to him. Who knew? So, Rick, thank you for making time. I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. We'll end on time as we always do. You'll get a link to a recording of this session, and we'll have more sessions. And remember, on Wednesday at 6 Eastern time, Karl Rove is going to chalk talk the Electoral College. If you're interested in the presidential, you won't want to miss that. It's something I've seen him do in private, never seen him do it in public. It's exceptionally interesting if you're interested in the presidential. Rick, thank you. Everybody have a good evening, and we'll see you Wednesday night and again soon.